My Nishka name is Samagit Galga. I come from the community of Gidlakdamics, and my family resides in Terrace, BC. My role in this process as an economic development advisor is to look at the preparation of what it takes when you look at the topic of economic development. In a business term, I view that as a setup, because in my experience of working in economic and business development over the years, is that we sometimes set up corporations and start them up at the same time without looking at what it takes to set them up, and then from that process you run into business conflict. Before I begin, culturally, I would like to acknowledge the traditional land from which we're speaking on today. And as a hereditary chief, I have to always do that. It is respectful and honorable. So thank you. And keeping with the program, I'll walk you through a preparation using a visual format, where on one side it's all about governance, and on the other side of my presentation it'll be about people. And it's a framework that I helped develop with a professor at University of Victoria, Dr. Mainprice, and also working with Miles as well. So I just want to take my watch off here so you keep track of my time, because I don't want to be running out of time for Q&A. First of all, I thank New Relationship Trust for inviting me to speak here today and present. And it's always an honor to share capacity and pass on what you know, or even the new ideas. Some of you may not be new, but what could be new is how you frame it up and better understand economic development, because economic development is a diverse, complex topic. And in this process, it's not a solution, but it's an option to consider visually. So in preparing, what I'll walk you through is 3 economic development myths, understand the common terms which you're probably familiar with, and bridge the gap between theory and practice using visual framework, and look at choices available in your community and choices that you make, and understand the productive roles between governance and economic development. And that's one of the key things, because if you can bridge that big gap, then your startup, you're on your way to a less bumpy ride. The first myth is economic growth and economic prosperity are distinct. Growth means quantitative increase in the physical dimensions of the economy. Prosperity occurs when quality improvement in quality of life and the assets of economy, the real source of wealth. And you hear this quite a bit in our communities, quality of life and economic development. And but they're also used, like growth and prosperity are sometimes used in the same tone, and or sometimes used, understanding could be used at the same when in fact they're not. So a growing economy is simply getting better, while a prosperous economy is getting better. Getting bigger, and a prosperous is getting better. Myth number 2, it's really about decision-based myths. Continue unsustainable fisheries, mining, and forestry practice, because in our area that's what we have a lot of: fishing, mining, forestry. We can't afford to lose jobs to conserve environment, but we promise to put it back once we afford to. The other part of that is big boats and salmon farms are 2 ways to make fisheries more productive and efficient. The pitfalls, like fisheries today, too many boats chasing too few fish. And when you look at mining or proponents that are taking wealth out of the earth, they have to put away the waste somewhere, and you have these mine tailing ponds. So those mine tailing ponds don't go away, and so it's up to us to be in there with proponents to mitigate the environmental impacts and really understand what you're leaving behind, because they'll be there forever. So the economic prosperity is living off Earth's interest, not her capital. So that's one of the second myths I'd like to share with you. The third one, business development and economic development are the same thing. The reality is business development creates new businesses from within as opposed to traditional economic development that spends money on infrastructure and marketing in hopes that a new business will come. Sustainable economic development equals strategic infrastructure development and business development. So these will go into more detail as I move through my slide presentation. And it's the old thing like, oh, let's go build a gas station. It's going to make us money. So the community spends a lot of money on infrastructure, environmental impacts, and then there's no marketing. Where's your traffic? So when you talk to business people who are developing fee simple lands, they look at feasibility studies and the viability and look at how you can get a return on your investment. And sometimes we don't make decisions on return on investment, or you may view it as patient capital where you spend example, if you spend 100,000, you don't want that 100,000 to be repaid back to your coffers in a few years. You may want it like 10 years for that. So those are ideas. Common terms used in economic development, like economic factors, are capital, labor, natural resources, and sometimes we forget technology. In my community, we have a non-dominant carrier internet service provider that provides connectivity to our government, health, school, and residential internet. And when you're running a business, you want cash injections for a corporation all the time, and internet was one of them. And it's serving its purpose well, but at the same time, you want to look at speed on technology, where a lot of people are on Facebook, social media, and if internet goes down, that phone starts ringing because people, it's too quiet, your phones aren't working, your iPad, you got nothing, and it's social media, and it's our people are adapted to that really well. Non-economic factors, institutional and social, attitude towards life and work, public and private structures, cultural traditions, systems of land tenure, property rights is a big one, and as Miles has talked about some of the foundations of governance, asserted rights, fee simple property, that's a key area for economic development. Integrity of government agencies, and this is to look at all levels, federal, provincial, and within your own community on acts, regulations, and then who monitors the implementations of those acts and regulations or policies that are developed. One of the definitions that Dr. Mainprize and I created in 2015 with working with First Nations was understanding and enabling a range of cultural, social, and economic choices for Indigenous communities and individual members / citizens that are desirable, viable, and feasible. And this will also come out in as we walk through the slide presentation. And we use the word choices because, in fact, when you're looking at economic development, we wanted to pass on capacity and use language that was easily understood. So one of the key words we use all the time is choices. And because choices are neither right or wrong, it's how you, whatever you make, then that starts your path. Because our role as advisors and in terms of economic development is not to come in and say, you're doing it wrong. In fact, what we want to do is transfer capacity to your community. So I've talked about choices, and then the other area is about governance, control on resources, governance and leadership, access and management, and then people's beliefs, strategy, empowerment. And so these two areas are key, and we call it the two-legged approach. One side you have governance, the other side you have people, and government sets up infrastructure, and then people need to get on that infrastructure, using that infrastructure to create wealth. So, and in this process, we use it visually, because descriptively, if I were to present it that way, I could lose you, because what we wanted to do was use a visual approach so that we can present all this detailed information in a time allotted today. So took a lot of thinking to get this through. I'm sorry about the small, that slide. When we look at traditional and non-traditional viewing opportunities, we call these stress points: economic development, governance and impact benefit agreements, land, real estate, forestry and non-timber and salmon resource. And this is really about how does your people think about these particular areas. And this list down here as choices is not complete, because you'd have to look in your own communities and put them on a lines and discuss them. An example I'll use is within our treaty, we have commercial fishery. But within our treaty, we have food is always first, ceremonial second, and third is commercial harvesting. So there's no guarantee of commercial harvest. Our people protect the salmon, and they study the return to Canada every year, and they sit down with a co-management process that Miles has talked about on a jurisdiction of salmon. And so our treaty, there's a percent return to Canada, and then every December, January, our scientists and our leaders sit down with Fisheries and Oceans Canada, and they come out with preliminary target figures. And so on this line, we're more conservative in salmon, so we're more on this side. Whereas if we wanted to just harvest everything we had, then we would be, and not conserve everything, then we would be way over here. So this is just a opportunity decision-making process that you would walk through. The other example is timber. As one young lady has said, timber, how much annual allowable cut would you do in a year? Is it sustainable? What's the turnaround on growth down here? 80 years. In our area, it's about 120 years. And we still have old growth. And when you look at the market arena for timber, when you're marketing timber, you need to decide who's your competition. And competition to our type of timber is Vancouver Island and Washington. The only difference is how we have tighter growth rings, where second growth, when a tree first starts growing, it has the first few years it has a wide growth ring. So when you get to know your product, then you're on your way to marketing. And so I kind of looked at economic development. I want to walk you to business development. And the business development is people-centered rather than process, resource-centered, or infrastructure-centered. It means working to uncover talents that already exist in our community members, nurturing and cultivating them rather than imposing outside ideas. This I hold to heart, because in all my years of economic development, it's good to bring in external capacity, but in a way that when that capacity leaves you, that some capacity is retained within your community. Otherwise, if you bring in external capacity or expertise, when that person leaves, so does all the knowledge. And then you've got to start all over again. We need to build our capacity within our youth, and then also build capacity, which Miles had mentioned, on our leadership side. Leaders need to understand economic development so that when they make decisions, they're more informed rather than we always look so quick to look at the bottom line and profitability. But my background, I came from government. I sat on a pre-treaty. So I helped build the first steps of Nisga'a economic development as a coordinator for Nisga'a government. Then I ran our corporation for almost 7 years as an operational guy. And now I'm a year and a half on my own and sharing knowledge. And that comes from our elders, because in 2002, our nation had a resources and sharing assembly in a community of Gingol, and they talked about resources and sharing our knowledge. And so that's what we do. And with New Relationship Trust, it's reality. These two triangles, and they're color-coded. Blue is the governance side, which we call Leg 1. And the Leg 1 is about infrastructure development. And Leg 2, the right side, is the your community members, and it's really the business development side. And so when you look at the base, I'll walk you through this, because some of the topics on here I won't be talking about. Other economic development advisors will be focusing on areas of governance and other areas. My role is to do the setup and the various pieces of economic development and try to capture it in a snapshot, so that as we move through the next 2 days, that it becomes a lot clearer, or maybe it won't be clear. So infrastructure is all done strategically by observing the community trends and projecting its future needs on leg one. Business development can only be done responsively by becoming available to self-motivated individuals on an as-needed, just-in-time basis. And a previous speaker talked about entrepreneurship and growing your wealth, and the excitement that an entrepreneur does, invest his or her own capital to see a business come to reality. And they do contribute back to your community by employing members. And also showing your leaders and youth that there is opportunity to be in the private sector, because private sector is 7 days a week, long hours, and it's not a 9-to-5 job. And infrastructure development is set up by government so that a private sector can get on that infrastructure to create wealth. So it's a relationship that's very key. On the control side, this could be your codes, acts, regulations. In addition to that, it's not just about, in this area, you look at the treaty or you look at your asserted rights. And then the others looks at under the Indian Act. So there's 3 themes that would be under control. So in our case, we have a treaty and we have acts, regulations, and we have to improve on those regulations and make them more user-friendly, so that they're not bogged down when an entrepreneur could be a nation corporation, village government corporation, or private sector. And use of those regulations and policies, it's government people that implement the policies, so they need to be on side with what's being developed. So the next important part is governance and leadership, whether it's at your government level, band, tribal council, or village government. And if your leadership are taking the same type of training or workshop in terms of economic development, what they implement is the wishes of our legislative body. And we just had a workshop in Lachkalzap where we had 4 of our communities together, and we had some leaders there, and the Speaker of the House mentioned something that is very key, and that was that the intent of our regulations needs to be now come with communication, so that the directors and CEO of Nishkalism's government level implement that intent, because sometimes we forget that. So communication is another key area all the way through the system. And then so I've looked at the acts, and I kind of, as an example, has listed the Election Act, housing policies, business development, education policies. Lots of your communities, you already have this in place, and it's that's what we call infrastructure. So infrastructure is not just physical assets, it's also the instruments that you use, your regulations and policies. That's what an entrepreneur would like to see when they want to do business. And the next level, the top level of that, is access and management. These are what do you do for your people's education, your schools, who manages your land and resources, whether it's under the Indian Act, under a treaty, your government, village government, band tribal councils, your health authorities, economic development departments. And what is key in this whole process between the governance and leadership and the institutions developed, the link between the elected body here, if I may, I'll use Andrew as an example. Andrew's the CAO of Lachel Village Government, so anything his community does, he's the link between the government's leadership as the CAO, Chief Administrative Officer, and what's going on in all these areas in his community. So he's very key, he's instrumental. And hope you don't mind, Andrew, putting you on the spot on that. As we move to the right side, the people side, the beliefs of your people as you're developing your economic development process is to look at these areas. What is your understanding of your community and views, and just the demographics of your membership, as this one young lady that was sitting here this morning sharing her statistics of their demographics, and what are the skill sets, because whatever you do in business, you need to harness the energy of down here people. And then strategically, what is the vision of your people? Without knowing that, you could be putting the cart before the horse. Or sometimes infrastructure on the government side is not ready for business development. And when you start your business development and you approach your leadership and you have this great idea, you got all your money in place, you got your capital, you got your assets, you got your operational plan or business plan, then you present it. They may not have the toolkits to assist you because they're not ready for it. So that business goes by the wayside. The other part of that same scenario is in a mine sector, if you're not ready for that, then most of those opportunities will go by the wayside and you'll have very few members working in there. And we have that example right in our community. There's a mine that's ready to open, and we'd be lucky if we have about 50 Nishka working in there. Very lucky. Even though we have an impact benefit agreement. An impact benefit agreement for us, I don't know what's in there. It's locked up, it's confidential. So we recently came out of an election where that the IBAs that we recently signed created mistrust because people wanted to know what's in that IBA agreement. So for those of you that are entering impact benefit agreements or negotiating, it's key to lock in there the business side and employment side, because these companies that come in, they will have a prime contractor look after everything, and prime contractors will bring in who they've been so used to working with all their lives. In our case, there's a lot of workers coming over from eastern parts of Canada, and a lot of these are general labor jobs that we could probably have, but we need to know what's there so that our administrators like Andrew could plan and train up his membership for those jobs. So it's a learning process for us in the Nishka environment. Took us 113 years to get our treaty. We're only 16 years into it. Actually, May of this year, it'll be our 17th anniversary. So my belief in this next 4-year term is going to try and look at more unlocking the road to business development, whether it's private sector or nation corporations or how we all work together. And Andrew will be one of those key people to champion that. And then the top level is all about empowerment, empowering your people. And these are through demographic studies of, if you've done the research on your membership, it's projecting what type of jobs will be out there in next year, 5 years, 10 years. In our case, we work in 4-year cycles, so we ask our leaders, what are your plans in the next 4 years? And even though we just came out of an election in November of last year, it takes time for a government to react and get up to speed with what's going on. And then they need to look at policies that they may want to effect change. And that takes time because it's an education process. And the other one is about what are the gaps in your backyard. There's lots of opportunities. And what are those opportunities? What are the job opportunities? And so so that you can plan for them, and so that your membership can go after those opportunities. And then what is your approach to close the gap? Because if you don't close the gap, then forever and a day you could be spinning your wheels and left on the sideline while other people are imported in to take those jobs. And so that's a process. So this whole process, I quickly walked through, I kind of raced through it because it's more about setting the tone, and other individuals will be speaking about the various steps as we go through today. And I wanted to respect that because as an operational person, I probably could talk about each one in detail, but I have a specific task, and it's kind of set this tone in using a visual framework approach that we call. And the other thing about doing it a two-legged approach, in your community, which infrastructure is stronger than the other? Is your government side stronger, or is your business development side stronger? And at some point in time, you would have to balance it out. Because sometimes we heard one of our elders speak to us, and he talked about, he said, there's too many meetings for the sake of meetings to discuss something. What is your action plan, and how would you implement and execute? And when you get to the implementation and execution, then those are the operational side that within your nation or communities that will benefit you. And if you have entrepreneurs already out there that are successful, then use them as role models in your community and say, this is what can be done if you put the time to commit to it. This slide, we had the permission of Tribal Resources Investment Corporation to present this slide, and it was a gap study in northwestern British Columbia in the booming era of exploring proposed pipeline lines with LNG proponents, TransCanada, and Spectra Energy. And what we looked at under the University of Victoria was the available jobs, qualified people, skill capacity gap, and then Tricor as a board and their administration looked at their approach and then came out with an action plan. And a good way to look at it is on this chart. Let's just fast forward this. So if we don't do anything, then this is the road we would stay on and do nothing. We'd be down here, and then as industry comes in, here's the jobs, peaks with a development, and it drops off. But if we start planning and action and implementing and training and working with industry, then we potentially could increase the local capacity. So that's what the whole approach was, is looking at your demographics in northwestern British Columbia. So the whole approach is to try and close that gap, increase the employment and contracting, because Tricor does loans to entrepreneurs, so it's really to try to get them in there. And we don't do this just in Tricor doesn't do this in isolation. They work with University of Victoria, they work with Miles Group, and really about sharing information and getting deep into organizational discussions of how to move forward. And then so the staff of Tricor, looking at the employment training side, are now looking at how do we train with current industry providers in northwestern BC so that it's not training now for the sake of training. Because there's I'm quite sure there's a few of us in here who will say there's too much training for the sake of training going on right now, where a government will have funds available. A good example is under the province of BC, under Ministry of Aboriginal Relations and Reconciliation, they have a pool of money and they're looking at training, but sometimes that training doesn't fit the local needs. Certificate driven, and if you get certified in certain areas, our human resources need to be multi-ticketed to get jobs. And this is where the other part here is if we didn't do anything, we'd be down here on our action plan. So we want to be up here. So the approach was to look at what energy development is going on, mining, community development, and then small business and services. And this is just all northwestern BC, which is Tricor's service delivery area. And this didn't include the Nishka, because this project was done under Tricor's Employment Skills Training Services program. Recently, Nishkalism's government, through its treaty, drew down on its share of programs and services money, so they do have Nishka employment skills training. So out of respect, they didn't analyze what is in a Nishka area. And this is just another pie chart, a chart graph that really looks at various trades, heavy equipment, maintenance, supervisor management, and then in various areas, when you look at 2015, goes right out quite a few years, and then look at where the jobs peak. So it kind of gives you as decision makers, if you're a shareholder of Tricor, you would look at all this and say, okay, let's gear our training in these areas. Let's look at management. So the process is to, when you look at economic development, is to really understand the demographics of your community, your members, and how you plan to achieve in the areas of business development. And then this last process is to emphasize that work within your people, wherever you can. Educate your own people so that capacity stays within your nation, rather than when you have good people that do come in, but sometimes those good people don't leave any capacity, and then you look for job postings, and then it becomes a cycle. And we've had that in Anishka under finance. We've had so many chief financial officers come and go, and that's a key position. And when industry sees that, you start, okay, what's going on? What's the stability? And we have one community that goes through a lot of CAOs, and so continuity is lost. And so we do, even though we have our treaty, we have our organizational, internal stuff that we're trying to improve on yet. So we have, our treaty is about hope. We have acts, regulation, land, all that, but we have to continue, and within our treaty, there is no economic development chapter. There's only mentions of economic interest and the environmental protection. And Chapter 10 of our treaty is the most powerful chapter. So with that, looking at the time, it's 11:15, so I'm done. So open for questions.